Have you ever heard your mother or your grandmother ever say that God works out everything for the greater good? Well, today we are going to be diving into the lesson of God working all things out for the believer's good. Without further ado, let's get right into this video. The topics that we're going to be dealing with in 1 Samuel chapter 29 are evil association. God actually deals with us and shows us how to have no association with evilness. His power, God's power, delivers us all the time. God's power also keeps us from terrible evil as well. We're going to dive into that. We're going to look at that. We're going to break that down. It's very important that this is how we know that God's book, his word, walking in his presence and knowing his Bible, studying, discerning everything that's in the Bible, why it works out for our greater good, how he protects us. And we're going to dive into that today. But before we start diving into it, we do have to learn some definitions of what we're going to be looking at. The first definition is we need to understand that what is evil association? Evil association, let's bring that up. What the Bible tells us about evil association, it can cause a person to deny Christ. We see that in Luke chapter 22, 54 verses 54 to 62, and John chapter 18 verses 18 to 25. Also, associating with evil corrupts good morals. We know that because it shows us in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 33. But we also have a duty not to associate with people who do evil. And we see that in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 11. We also see not to be unequally yoked together with an unbeliever. That's given it to us also in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 14. Not to fellowship with an unfruitful work of darkness, Ephesians chapter 5, verse 11, and to come out from and to be separated from evil actions or evil acts, 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 17 to 18, and to save oneself from this evil generation, Acts chapter 2, verses 40. So now we know what's evil association. So now we must know and we must learn God's power. God's power has the ability to deliver us and his people. So we need to know God's power. And what does God's power mean? So here's a few scriptures that gives us a better definition of the Bible telling us about God's power and what it is. Let's go over to Exodus chapter 9, verse 16, and it reads, "But I have spared you for a purpose, to show you my power and to spread my fame throughout the earth." We also see life in the power of the tongue. In Proverbs chapter 18, verses 21, the tongue will bring death or life. Those who love to talk with reap the consequences. We also see in Matthew chapter 22, verse 29, it deals with the scriptures or the power of God, which reads, Jesus replied, "Your mistakes is that you don't know the scriptures and you don't know the power of God." We also see the right hand of power and coming in Matthew chapter 26, verse 64, and it reads, Jesus replied, "You have said it, and in the future you will see the Son of Man seated in a place of power at God's right hand and coming on the clouds of heaven." We also see you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes upon you. But you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes upon you, and you will be my witness, telling people about me everywhere in Jerusalem, throughout Judea and Samaria, and to the end of the earth. So these are some of the things of God's power. And now we have a better understanding of God's power. So let's move on. So now let's read 1 Samuel chapter 29 and get into that. Let's read. So again, keep in mind that what we're going to be reading is the dismissal of David to keep him from fighting against Israel, a picture of God's working all things out for the believer. We'll see that. Now let's start. 1 Samuel chapter 29. The Philistines rejected David. The entire Philistine army now mobilized in Ephek, and Israel camped at the spring of Jezreel. At the Philistines, rulers were leading out their troops in groups of hundreds and thousands. David and his men marched at the rear with King Achish. But the Philistine commander demanded, "Where are these Hebrews doing here?" And Achish told them, "This is David, the servant of King Saul of Israel. He has been with me for years, and I've never found a single fault in him from the day he arrived until today. But the Philistine commanders were angry. Send him back to the town you've given him. They demanded, you cannot go into battle with us. What if he turns against us in battle and become our adversary? Is there any better way for him to reconcile himself with his master than by handing our hands over to him? Isn't this the same David about whom the women of Israel sing in their dances? Saul has killed his thousands and David his tens of thousands. So Achish finally summoned David and said to him, I swear by the Lord that you have been a trustworthy ally. I think you should go with me until battle, for I've never found a single flaw in you from day you arrived until today. But the other Philistine rulers won't hear of it. Please don't accept them, but go back quietly. What have I done to deserve this treatment? David demanded. What have you ever found in your servant that I can't go and fight the enemy of my lord, the king? But Achish insists, as far as I'm concerned, you are perfect as an angel of God, but the Philistine commanders are afraid to have you with them in battle. Now get up early in the morning and leave with your men as soon as it gets light. So David and his men headed back into the land of the Philistines, while the Philistine army went on to Jezreel. That is God's holy word. Now let's break it down. We'll be seeing in verses 1 and 2 what we'll be gleaning from that. Now we see the predicament of David, a lesson on evil association. Now we'll see a lesson on evil association. And where do we see that? In verses 1 to 2. What we see and what we read, the Philistines marched to invade Israel, the promised land of God. Their army was massive. The difficulties of David's situation, we see this. What was they? He had been ordered to march and fight against Israel, the same Israel that he has been anointed to become king of. But also what we see in verses 3 to 5 is the solution of David's predicament. God gave a solution, a picture of God's power to deliver his people. And we see that in 3 to 5. First, the surprise of the Philistine commanders to see Hebrews in the ranks. They questioned Achish. We see that, right? The next one, the answer of Achish. He had confidence in David's loyalty. However, the anger of the commanders in their demand that David be discharged, dismissed, or sent back. Because why? Because he might betray them and turn against them. Because he might use the battle as an opportunity to join the Israelites and gain Saul's favor. Because David been a famous enemy of the Philistines. His exploits had even been celebrated in songs by the women. We see this, but also we do see from 6 to 11 the dismissal and discharge of David from this battle. Now we see the picture of God's power to keep the believer, which is David, from terrible evil. We see that in verses 6 to 9. How? Well, let's start. The dismissal by Achish. He commended David. He commended him. He gave the reason for the dismissal. The commanders opposed him. He gave 3 brief orders: turn back, go, and do nothing. The objection of David we see. What was his objection? He asked why the complaint or suspicion. He wanted to fight against Israel or pretend he did for his lord, the king, Achish, or Saul, or God. I think David, and you tell me in the comments, because this is something that we really need to discuss, is he knew that he was the anointed king and he was actually going to fight with the Philistines against Israel. Do you really think that he was going to fight against the Philistines in Israel? Or do you think that he was going to turn his back on those Philistines and then become their adversaries and pretend like he was going to take them out? What do you think in the comments? I think that he was going to turn his back on those Philistines and fight with Israel. Or I think that he could have been in a tough situation to where that he didn't want to see the king fail, and he was going to help the king out, and he was going to make sure that though Israel men got slaughtered, that the king and Jonathan lived. But we'd never know. But you tell me in the comments what you think it might have been against Israel, and pretended he did for his lord the king. Which king? Achish or Saul or God? The vindication of David by King Achish. How did King Achish actually vindicate David? David had been as an angel of God, blessed the king. David was dismissed only because of the commander's insistence. We see that. We also see the urgency of David's arising and leaving early, lest he angered the commanders. We see that. We also see the deliverance of David from his predicament. He left, avoided fighting against Israel, avoiding helping an enemy conquer the promised land, avoiding from helping an enemy conquer the very kingdom that he's been anointed to protect and defend. We see how God didn't allow him to be put in that predicament. We see the power of God to change the hearts of other people, to protect his believers, to protect his people. We must always remember that God does protect his people. God will always protect his people. The ones who follow him, believe in him, and have faith in him and trust in him. So we always hear our grandparents say, God works things out for the greater good in our lives. Now we know where that comes from. So next, we'll be talking about 1 Samuel chapter 30. We'll be going into 1 Samuel chapter 30. Make sure you hit the subscribe button so you could be notified when I upload new videos. You're here already, so you might as well hit the subscribe button. We are continuing to listen to the prophets and study the prophets because we get some really good learning lessons from the prophets to be able to know the attributes of God, and we're going to continue. And also, Jesus Christ taught his disciples from the Bible from beginning to end within hours. So I promised myself that I am going to go through the entire Bible, teaching you guys and learning for myself and studying with you guys so that we'll be able to know and be very understanding with the Bible. But I want to thank you for watching. God bless you and God bless your family. I'll see you in the next video.